by your local cable or satellite provider.
Peter Thiel, what does the title of your book, 0 to 1, mean?
Well, 0 to 1 refers to any sort of innovation or doing anything new where you do the first thing of its kind. So the first word processor, the first smartphone, the first car, the first plane. It has this connotation of a breakthrough innovation that involves some sort of a quantum leap rather than just a small incremental innovation. And my book is about how we as a society need to be innovating more, and how the really significant innovations that move the dial are these breakthrough 0 to 1 companies.
Is Silicon Valley a 0 to 1? Does that have a 0 to 1 mindset?
There's definitely Silicon Valley at this point is the center of innovation in the U.S. and I would argue the center of innovation globally. There are certainly a number of companies that have involved these significant breakthroughs. I would say Google, Amazon, Facebook are significant ones in recent years. Apple with the iPhone. There's always a bias to make things very incremental. So I would say the successful companies in Silicon Valley are all 0 to 1 companies. Most companies end up being more incremental, more me too, and much less valuable. So the 4th online pet food company, the 10th thin film solar panel company, that's not a 0 to 1. That's a 1 to N. That's copying other things, and that's, I think, moves the dial much less.
Peter Thiel, how is your company, PayPal, a 0 to 1 company?
Well, it was the first one to combine email with money, which is sort of a very much of a breakthrough product idea. And then it turned out that to make this product work, you had to solve some very tricky fraud issues so that people could transact in a way that was fast, easy, and secure. And it was definitely the first company of its kind. It grew very quickly, and so it represented a real breakthrough in payments. It's often, one sort of measure I often give for these companies are things where you have an order of magnitude improvement on some important dimension. And so Amazon had more than 10 times as many books as the next biggest bookstore. PayPal, the alternative to PayPal was to send checks to these eBay power sellers, which took 7 to 10 days to clear. With PayPal, you got the money instantaneously, which was, again, a much faster process.
Where did you come up with the idea about electronic payments?
Well, it's often not that you sort of come up with the whole idea in a single flash of inspiration. I was very interested in this question of digital currency, of all these ways of what was the nature of money, how could it be shifted, and so we were sort of focused on this intersection of cryptography and money. And then in the course of a year, there were all these different challenges one struggles with. So even if you can come up with a new technology, how will people adopt it? And then we sort of stumbled on this idea that email was something everyone already had, and so perhaps we should try to link money with email. But I think a lot of these companies, the ideas are not fully formed on day one, but it's sort of a subject that people are extremely passionate about. They think about really hard, and then the process of that, you really refine the business model and the idea and come up with a great strategy.
And in your book, 0 to 1, you write, when I was running PayPal in late 1999, I was scared out of my wits. Not because I didn't believe in our company, but because it seemed like everyone else in the Valley was ready to believe anything at all.
Well, certainly there was an extraordinary bubble in the tech industry in the late 90s, which and in many ways, we're still suffering from the hangover of that. People are skeptical of technology. They're skeptical of Silicon Valley. But the bubble was driven by very unrealistic expectations about growth, sometimes unrealistic expectations about cash flows, and basically, it ended up collapsing in the course of the next 3 years as the Nasdaq went from 5,000 back to just over 1,000. People often ask whether we have a bubble today in Silicon Valley. And I don't think that's the case. I think these bubbles, whether in tech stocks in the 90s or housing and finance in the last decade, these bubbles are all psychosocial phenomena in which you need to get the public as a whole involved. The public was very much involved in the tech bubble in the 90s because you had somewhere on the order of 300 tech IPOs a year. Today, 2013, 2014, the public is far less involved. The IPOs are happening much later. Part of it's Sarbanes-Oxley. Part of it is that the tech companies themselves don't want to go public. They want to be able to build their businesses privately. And because the public is not involved, I do not think we have a bubble this time around. And I think that what's actually happening this time is a long boom that I would expect to go on for many, many years to come.
And you further write that the overwhelming importance of future profits is counterintuitive even in Silicon Valley. For a company to be valuable, it must grow and endure, but many entrepreneurs focus only on short-term growth.
Well, we did this exercise at PayPal in March of 2001. We looked at our future discounted cash flows, and we concluded that about 3/4 of market capitalization, 3/4 of the value of PayPal as of 2001 came from cash flows in years 2011 and beyond. And that sort of math, I think, is true for almost all these high-growth stocks. Most of the value exists a decade or more in the future. Investors and entrepreneurs tend to be very focused on the growth variable because that's what you can measure in the near term. How much did we grow over the last week, the last month, the last quarter? Whereas the question, will your company still be around a decade from now, is more qualitative, but is actually more important. And so I think the durability of this question of why do you have a permanent lead, why will your company be something of near permanent value, is an extremely important one for entrepreneurs and investors to think about.
Peter Thiel, what makes for a good, successful venture capitalist mindset?
Well, I always have a somewhat slightly contrarian approach to the conventional wisdom. I think the conventional wisdom in venture capital is that it's somewhat of a portfolio theory. You invest in a lot of different companies. You sort of treat them as though they were lottery tickets of one sort or another. And I think it's a bad way to treat people. You never want to treat the entrepreneurs, the founders, as lottery tickets. But it's also a bad way to invest because when you think that things are a lottery ticket, that you're multiplying a small probability with a big payoff, when you multiply a small number with a big number like that, you typically just end up with a small number. When you think in terms of lottery tickets, you've psyched yourself into losing. And so instead, what I've tried to do over the years is only invest in things where I have very high levels of conviction. It ends up being a somewhat more concentrated approach. And so instead of the rule, don't put all your eggs in one basket, I think it's often a good idea to put your eggs in one basket that you understand very well and that you're going to guard really well.
What convinced you to invest then early on in Facebook?
Well, Facebook in 2004 was something of a no-brainer. The site was already live at 20 colleges. They had 100,000 users. They only needed money to buy computers to go to more colleges. People were skeptical of social networking. They weren't focused on the college market. And so it was a reasonable valuation for something that had tremendous momentum. I think in today's context, I invested at a time when Facebook was valued at about $5 million. In today's context, a company with similar metrics would be valued easily at something like $100 million. So I think people were, in 2004, were simply too pessimistic about the internet generally, still having a very acute sense of this hangover from the 90s. The engineering team at Facebook was already quite good. They were going to build a very scalable product. Zuckerberg was extremely focused and extremely passionate about it, and it turned out to be a great investment, much better than I would have even thought at the time. So I thought it was a good investment. Would never have thought at the time that it would become a $200 billion company that it's become today.
Peter Thiel, from where did this book stem? You talk about a class you taught at Stanford.
Well, the 0 to 1 book came out of a class that I taught at Stanford in the spring of 2012. It was taught to, it was basically, I tried to convey everything I've learned about technology, business, startups in a single course. One of the students in the course, Blake Masters, took these notes, posted them on the internet. Somewhere on the order of 300 to 400,000 people read these notes on the internet, and we thought that it would be a great follow-up project to try to distill these notes, improve them, and put them into this 200-page book, 0 to 1, which is what we ended up doing.
On the first day of class, what did you want your students to know?
Well, there's no single there's probably no single lesson. I think there are many different lessons to teach people, but I would say the single overarching theme of my class and of the book 0 to 1 is that people should rethink competition. Most business books tell you how to compete more effectively. Mine tells you that perhaps you should not compete at all, and that as a founder or entrepreneur, you should always aim for something like a monopoly, a 0 to 1 company that's such a breakthrough that you have no competition at all. And I think we often overrate competition for all sorts of reasons. We find it appealing to do things that other people are doing. And so the classic example of a bad business is to start a restaurant, which is brutal competition. Nobody ever makes any money. And then the great examples are these businesses that often no one's even thought of doing, like Google and search or Facebook and social networking, that when they work end up being incredibly valuable. I try to get at this through these somewhat contrarian questions. It's like what great business is nobody building? Or the intellectual version of this question, which I always like asking as an interview question, is tell me something that's true that very few people agree with you on. And this turns out to be a shockingly hard interview question because in an interview people think you have to come up with something really brilliant, but then even when people have answers, when there are things they think that are true that most people don't agree with them on, it's often uncomfortable to articulate these truths. And so you need, I think, both some insight, but also a great deal of courage to come up with these truths or to build some of these 0 to 1 businesses.
Well, you asked that question, you return to it throughout 0 to 1, and one of the example answers you give is that God does not exist or there is no God, and you say that is a bad answer to that question. Why is that?
Well, because that's either the answer that God exists or that God does not exist is a bad answer, because those are simply two different sides of a conventional debate. And there's sort of a lot of people on both sides of that debate. And so I think the really interesting answers are things that very few people agree with you on, but that are also true. So it's not simply a matter of going against the conventional wisdom. It's equally important to come up with something that is true in one way or another. I give a whole set of my answers to these questions in the course of the book, and so I think that I think, for example, a monopoly over competition question is one that's very underexplored. I think that we're in a world where people are very focused on globalization and on copying things that work, but I think that actually for those of us living in the United States or Western Europe, the question of technology is more important than globalization. So I think there are sort of many answers to this question, but they're never trivial to find.
The best startups, you write, might be considered slightly less extreme kind of cults. The biggest difference is that cults tend to be fanatically wrong about something important.
Well, I think a great startup is always united by a sense of mission, of what the company is going to do that nobody else in the world is doing. When my PayPal colleague Elon Musk started SpaceX back in 2002, the goal was to be the first company to build rockets that would be powerful enough to send human beings to Mars. And this was a very inspiring goal. Nobody else in the world thought it was possible. Most people wouldn't even think this made sense, but it inspired a really talented group of rocket scientists to come together and help build that company over the last 12 years. And so I think it's always this sense of if we did not do this, if we were not working on this, nobody else would. That's very powerful. And it is sort of like a cult in that you have some privileged knowledge or you have some insight into the world that's not shared by other people. But in a good startup, unlike in a bad cult, that knowledge turns out to be true, and you're working on something that's real or that becomes real in the course of working on it.
Peter Thiel, what is the power law you write about?
Well, the power law is this distribution of the sizes of these technology companies. And so if you look at the tech industry in the U.S., the top dozen tech companies have a market capitalization of about $2 trillion, and they're probably as big or bigger than all other tech companies combined. And so you end up with these radically unequal outcomes in terms of company size. And sort of unlike the U.S. Declaration of Independence, where all men are created equal, in the case of business, not all companies are created equal, and some end up being vastly more successful than others. As a venture capital investor, it's typically the case that your single best investments ends up being worth more than all the others combined. And so this is a very strange dynamic, and it's worth thinking through a great deal. And sort of an application of the power law to entrepreneurs and to founders is that it's perhaps not always the right thing to start a company. You may be much better off joining a company that's going to be very successful. The 100th person at Google, no matter what you did, was better off than the average founding CEO of the average venture-backed startup in Silicon Valley. And so we sometimes privilege founding companies too much, and we undervalue the potential scale. And so we overvalue founding, undervalue scaling. And so I think it's always worth thinking really hard about whether you'll be able to build a great company or whether you might be better off joining another company that's doing something truly great.
You spend quite a bit of time in your book on the U.S. educational system. Is it assisting, is it promoting this type of entrepreneurship?
Well, I've been a big critic of the U.S. education system, focus a lot on higher education, where you have this runaway student debt. We now have over $1 trillion of student debt. I think we have a bubble in higher education, and I think that it is. I do not think that it is actually helping people do more entrepreneurial or more risk-taking things. When you graduate from college with $100,000 of debt, you will take a safe, reasonably well-paying job to pay off your debt, and you will be much less likely to do something entrepreneurial or creative or artistic, which may pay less but ultimately create more value. And so I do think that there's a big problem with the debt, and there's a big problem with the way education generally is somewhat overvalued. The analogy that I've given is that the colleges today are in a crisis similar to the crisis the Catholic Church faced at the start of the 16th century. They're charging more and more. You have this priestly or professorial class that's extracting a lot of the rents, just like the indulgences the Catholic Church had in the early 1500s. And we're told that it's the only way to go. You go to Yale or you go to jail. That basically, if you do not get a diploma, if you get a diploma, you will be saved. If you do not get a diploma, you will go to hell, or something, some sort of secular modern equivalent of that. And I think that's very wrong. And we need to find a wider range of different things for people to do. I think the post-education bubble world will be a world in which there's not a single track, not a single path, but there are many different things that different people will be able to do.
What did we learn? How significant was the tech bubble of the late 90s, early 00s?
It was extremely big. It was extremely distorting. I think as so often happens with these things, people learn a lot of things, but they often learn very much the wrong lessons. And I think the main lessons people learned in the immediate aftermath was to be less ambitious, to try less big projects, to get to profitability immediately. And so the aftermath of the tech bubble was to push us even more towards incrementalism. It was, of course, to discourage a lot of people from going into technology at all. You had business to consumer, business to business were these buzzwords in the 90s, B2C, B2B. In the 2000s, they were jokingly referred to as B2C was back to consulting, B2B was back to banking. And so the aftermath of the tech bubble was that people basically went away from tech. And so we had this enormous misallocation of resources into tech and then out of tech. And I think we would have been better off with much less volatility on the upside and the downside.
Back to your Stanford class, was that done in the economics department, the computer science department? Which department?
We did it through the computer science department. We thought that it would be that this would be the best way to reach a lot of the people who are starting these companies. So there is sort of, at this point, a strong bias towards engineering and product as the core of these new tech companies. Although it was really open to people across the board in the university and got a lot of attention far beyond the campus.
Peter Thiel, you're quoted in several different places as saying, we wanted flying cars, we got 140 characters. What does that mean?
Well, it's a tagline on our venture capital Founders Fund website, and it's basically that that we, that if you sort of think about the promises of the Jetsons of the 50s, 60s, there were all these fantastic ideas people had about technology, and there is a sense that something like Twitter is not enough to take our civilization to the next level. And so I've had this view more generally that we are living in an era of relative technological stagnation. We've had a lot of innovation in the world of bits, computers, internet, mobile internet, all those sorts of things. We've had much less innovation in the world of atoms, whether it's energy, food production, underwater cities, flying cars, supersonic aircraft, all the kinds of things people would have talked about in the 50s and 60s. And this is reflected in the way in which the word technology today doesn't mean rockets or flying cars. It means just information technology. So there's been a narrowing of focus. We've had this narrow cone of innovation around this world of bits. But I think to really improve the quality of our society, we need innovation in all these other dimensions as well. And the hope is that we will have some widening of this aperture in the decade ahead, and that we will once again start innovating in many different areas.
What's Palantir?
Palantir is a company that I co-founded back in 2004. It's a data analytics company which enables people both in government, large corporations, to analyze a lot of the data to find national security threats or criminal activity, fraud. It helps you with cybersecurity in some of the large corporate contexts. And it basically comes out of this idea we had at PayPal that a lot of the problems in our world are not going to be solved by humans alone or by computers alone, and that what you really have to do is figure out ways to get the division of labor to be right between the two of them. And so it's Palantir, it's basically a way for human investigators, human analysts to work much more effectively with computers to analyze large amounts of data. And this is actually sort of a very underexplored paradigm, because the dominant idea that we have in the computer world is that computers are substitutes for people, that computers will replace people in one way or another. The Palantir paradigm is much more that computers and humans are complements. They're different, they're good at very different kinds of things, and the key thing to building a lot of great innovation is not to figure out how do we get computers to replace people, but how do we get computers and people to work together far more effectively. And so I think that's a sort of a general template that could be used in many different contexts.
Given some of the topic areas that Palantir works on, have you worked with the federal government on some of these issues, such as cybersecurity?
Yeah, we've worked with a number of the three-letter agencies in D.C. We've worked with various law enforcement, various defense organizations in D.C. It's always a very long procurement cycle to break into the federal space, but I think after 10 years, Palantir has made a lot of traction, and I think it's had some impressive results.
What makes you a libertarian? Why do you donate to Republicans?
Well, it's always hard to fully characterize one's views politically. I would say that I'm socially more liberal, fiscally more conservative, which sort of is, and so generally, if you had sort of a litmus test of various political issues, I would come down a libertarian on a lot of different things. In general, I'm always a little bit skeptical about how much our political system will fix things. I think politics is both very important and very broken in this country, and so I spend most of my time working on technology, which is a place where I think people can really move the dial and really make the difference. So while I find politics incredibly interesting in theory, I find it in practice to be endlessly frustrating, which I think is not even a very unconventional view.
Does Washington understand Silicon Valley? Does it need to? Does it get in the way?
Well, I certainly think that there's too much regulation of certain areas of technology, and so so I think one of the reasons we've had this tale of two tracks of innovation with very fast in computers, which were relatively unregulated, and very slow in other areas. When it costs you $100,000 to start a new software company, it costs you about $1 billion to get a drug through the FDA on average. That tells you that we're going to have fewer biotech companies and more software companies. So I think DC is extremely important for what happens in Silicon Valley. I think the two cultures are quite different and that they don't understand each other terribly well. I think Washington, D.C. Ends up being focused very much on process. It's dominated by lawyers, and there's sort of a certain framework people with that sort of background bring to ideas. Silicon Valley is more focused on substance, is more dominated by engineering, and so you have sort of a very different kind of a mindset of how to approach things. I would say one general bias people in Washington, D.C. have is that technology is not that important. It's not something people are experts in. I once looked at the people in Congress. There are 535 senators, congressmen. At a generous count, maybe 35 of them have a background in science or technology or engineering, and the rest of them are really clueless, and they wouldn't understand that windmills don't work when the wind is not blowing, or that solar panels don't work at night. And so they're uncomfortable about science, they're uncomfortable about technology, and so in general it's something people want to stay away from here.
In your book, you're critical of the educational testing system. How did you grade your students at Stanford?
Well, we did have a single test at the end of the course, as well as a presentation people had to give on a company that they would try to build. So I don't think you can avoid testing. I don't think you can avoid grading if you're going to have an educational system. I think it becomes a problem when everyone has to do the same things, when everyone is evaluated in exactly the same way, because the end product is not that everyone should be going to the same schools or studying the same subjects. And so I do think so in an individual class you would grade people. I don't know if we need to be grading people as much in our society as a whole and put it quite as much weight as we do on SAT tests or all these standardized aptitude tests that are used to track people into these sort of very homogeneous careers.
Do you see yourself teaching another class?
I've done this every few years, so I will do so again at some point in the future. One of the things that's always fantastic about teaching is that it does force you to pull together an enormous amount of material and organize it in a way, and you end up, you hope the students learn a lot. Certainly, as teacher, you end up learning a tremendous amount, and so even though I'm a critic of the universities, I'm not at all a critic of learning, and I think learning is good, even if a lot of what gets put under this education rubric is more problematic. But I'm a big fan of people learning, not just in college, but throughout life.
The book is called 0 to 1, Notes on Startups or How to Build the Future. Peter Thiel with Blake Masters is the author. Thank you.
C-SPAN, creating